Welcome everyone to Farms Weekly Wednesday webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about pressure canning with Annie from Morning Joy Farm. This is the first of our webinars that we're holding in this session or this semester, and you can check out other webinars and keep signing up for them at www.farms.org. Everyone on the call today will be placed on mute while the presenter is presenting. However, at the end of the session, I will be asking questions that you can either type in the chat box or raise your hand, and I will allow you to ask Annie a question directly. So without any further ado, I will turn the session over to Annie Carlson from Morning Joy Farm.
Thanks, Sue. Are you going to turn the screen over to me?
Let's see now. Change presenter. Okay, yeah, I'm showing my screen now. Doggone it. I'm out of practice. I haven't done this for a while. There we go. Do you have... Okay, you should be the presenter. Yes! Alrighty then.
All right. If anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box, and I will answer them as we go along. Like Sue said, my name is Annie. My name is Annie Carlson. I farm at Morning Joy Farm. It's 50 miles straight north of Bismarck. I've canned my whole life. I came from a family of canners. My mom canned, my grandparents canned, and my mom never really pressure canned. And so I, do the water bath canning, and then I found these really cool recipes, and it said you have to pressure can them. And so I asked my mother-in-law, I'm like, what is this pressure canning? Like, what do I need for that? Well, in the meantime, my great aunt had passed away, and one of the things that I received from her was her pressure canner. And so I knew I had all the materials that I needed, and I just needed someone to kind of hold my hand through that first process, that first canner load. And then it was like a spark to a pile of kindling, and my canning has exploded. And like my husband jokes that if you leave anything in the kitchen too long, Annie will can it. So I can everything. I love to can. Right now I have a batch of pizza sauce cooking down in my oven. And so I will can 12 months out of the year. During this time of the season is when I'm putting up that fresh garden produce. And so I'm pressure canning green beans and carrots, and the sweet corn's about ready to come in. So those are the things that I'm pressure canning now. But during the winter months, I love to pressure can meats, meals in a jar, potatoes, those sorts of things. We'll talk more about them as we go along. But just to tell you that the sky is the limit with pressure canning. You can really preserve a lot of food for long-term storage. I know a lot of people like to freeze, but freezing is only good for up to a year when you're talking about vegetables. So I love to keep vegetables on my shelf longer than that. And pressure canning, they will be good for years. In fact, I was just downstairs organizing my pantry last night for some new canning stuff that's coming in, and I have some carrots from 2009 that are still on the shelf and looking great, and some vegetable soup from 2008. And just, it's great to have those things in reserve. Even if they're a couple years old, they're still good as long as that seal is still good. So let's talk about pressure canning. And I'll walk you through some basics and kind of some differences that people talk about, and then we'll talk more about specifics in canning. First of all, the history of canning. Canning came about, we have Napoleon to thank for our canning habit. He wanted a way to take food over the Alps so he could invade other countries and conquer them for the French Empire. And so he offered a prize to anyone who could come up with a long-term food storage option. And so a Frenchman came up with the concept of canning food into tins and glass jars with a wire bale over the top. And so he won the prize from Napoleon, and he invented canning. And so canning hasn't changed a whole lot since that time. We're still using glass jars. Commercially, they're still using tin to can, metal to can. And so we really haven't changed a lot. And so it's kind of a constant in the midst of a sea of change. I want to briefly talk about the anatomy of a canning jar, because sometimes when we're reading directions, we may not know exactly what they're referring to. So the top metal piece is called the metal screw band. And when you're looking at metal bands, you can reuse them year after year. I certainly do. Some people will tell you that you can't use them if they are rusty, which is not true. You can use them if they have some rust on them. You can't use them if they're rusted through. So I have some bands that are rusty, but they are not rusted through, and so I can keep using them. One of the things that will keep them in good shape longer is if you remove them when you're storing your jars. So once the food has sealed, you want to wait about 24 hours, and then you can remove that screw band and reuse that in your next canner. But you do want to wait at least 24 hours because you want that food and that jar to completely cool before you remove that band. Otherwise, that lid can release. The second part in the middle there is the metal lid. If you're using a metal lid, this is the part that you should not reuse. So the jar makes an imprint in that gasket, that rubber gasket on the inside, and unless you can match that up perfectly, which believe me, you can't, you should not reuse metal lids. I had some friends who were going to can jelly for the first time, and their grandma told them, "Oh, just reuse that metal lid." So they did, and they had an 85% failure rate, which would be crushing if you're doing it for the first time. So the reason our grandmothers said you can reuse that lid is because back in the olden days there was more rubber on that lid, and it was thicker, so you could make a different imprint and it would still seal. These days, the lids are designed for a one-time use only, and you're really not going to be able to use that rubber one more time. The mouth and jar threads, anytime you're looking at canning jars, and people, once they find out you're a canner, people will give you jars upon jars. The thing I do is take my finger and run them across the lids. There was a year that Turtle Lake had an all-city rummage sale, and I think I bought every canning jar in Turtle Lake. But I didn't buy them unless I ran my finger around every lid and make sure there were no nicks or cuts or any like bubble of glass that would impair the seal. So you want to just run your finger around and make sure that there's nothing there that's going to make the seal fail. And don't take them if they're not a standard size canning jar. Miracle Whip used to be sold in jars that the rings would fit on, and so you could can in a Miracle Whip jar. But now the Miracle Whip jars that are glass, you can no longer, the rings don't fit. So if you have a chance to run a ring around them and make sure that they fit, do that. I was stuck with a box of mayonnaise jars that nothing will fit on, so they're now flour bases. So just make sure and beware before somebody gives you a big box of them that you do run your finger across and make sure that there's no defect. The shoulders of the jar, that's where the jar gets bigger when it comes off of the threads. That's where you're going to be looking for your headspace. So in your recipes, headspace is very important in pressure canning because you're putting that jar under pressure. You want to have your accurate headspace as indicated in your recipe. If you have too little of headspace, the pressure will blow the contents of your jar out the lid, which, depending on what you're canning, will cause a lid failure. For example, if you're doing a broth, say I'm doing chicken broth, and I don't follow the recommended headspace, which I have done this, thinking, oh, I'll just, I have a little bit left, I'll just squeak it in there. It will blow the broth out the lid, and then it leaves the fat in your broth on between the lid and the ring, or lid and the seal of the jar, the lip, and that will cause a failure. So be very careful and pay attention to headspace between the top of the jar down to the shoulder, whether it's a half inch, whether it's an inch, make sure you're paying attention to that headspace. The body of the jar is where you're going to fill it. You want to make sure when you're filling your jar that you fill it as completely as you can. You don't want air bubbles in there. You want to remove them. I just use a butter knife and run it through your product to remove the air bubbles. And then the heel of the jar, every year when I'm canning, I break one jar. It's always one, and it's every year. And it's from tapping the heel against something, and I get like a little microscopic crack, and as soon as you put it into the canner and apply some pressure, it splits around the heel of the jar. Which, once that happens, the food that was in that jar will fall out, and you can't reuse it. So one year, it's usually happened with vegetables. It was corn one year, it was carrots another year, green beans, and then one year it was chicken broth. And oh, I cried. And my husband said, well, why are you so worked up? This happens to you every year. And I said, yes, but this time it was liquid gold. It was chicken broth. So I see we have a question. Let me look at it. Oh, Sue asked, will that cause the other jars to fail to seal, or can you salvage the rest of the jars in the canner? You can absolutely save the rest of the jars. You don't want to reuse that food that was in that jar because there may be shards of glass in there that you can't see. So you want to make sure that you take your other jars out. I always rinse them off just to make sure there's no, whatever you were canning, like the chicken broth, I want to make sure there's no broth on the outside of my jars. So I wash the jars very well, and then wash my canner out, make sure I rinsed everything so that there was no broth still on it. But you can use the jars will be fine. They'll seal and they'll be fine. What'll happen is that you'll find the jar that broke will also seal, and it'll be stuck on, and you can't even get your ring off. So yes, you can use the rest of the jars in the canner. So that's the anatomy of a canning jar. So when you're reading a recipe and it says, pay attention to your headspace or metal screw bands or whatever, that's what you're looking at. Jar sizes. If you've tried to buy new jars, my goodness, are there a variety of sizes and shapes, even colors. So let's talk a little bit about the different jar sizes. Half pints, the little one in the front there is a half pint. That's a 1 cup liquid measure jar. They take many different shapes. There's wide mouth, there's regular mouth, half pints, there's all sorts of stuff. Those are usually for jellies, jams, conserves, marmalades, something that you want a small serving of. I often use half pints. I'll use them today for my pizza sauce. Every Friday my family has homemade pizza, and so I use a half a cup of sauce per pizza. So canning it in a half pint, my family eats 2 pizzas, so that works perfect for a single serving. I use it every Friday night. So I'm canning pizza sauce today. I'll use my half pints for pizza sauce. I also can my relish in half pints, just so I don't have a lot of jars cluttering up the fridge. We can usually polish off a jar of relish in 1, maybe 2 sittings if it's in a half pint. So I try and ration my half pints to those things that I don't want to keep in the fridge and that my family will use all in 1 sitting. Next is pints. There are also wide mouth and regular sized pints. I like to use pint jars for things like jelly. My family, I have 3 kids. My family likes to eat, if we eat jelly, we're eating a fair amount of jelly, so I like to can my jelly in pints. I'll also can things like chicken meat, ham, those sorts of things in pints because I can add those to scalloped potatoes or to a casserole in pint sizes. You can also use half pints for those depending on the size of your family and your recipes. Half pints are certainly good to use with meat when you're using it as a flavoring as well. Other things I can in pints, salsa, I'll do some in pints, some in quarts. I do pickles in pints because I like to finish them off at one sitting, and so my family usually eats a pint of pickles at a time. And so I'll usually do pickles in pints. I do pickled beets in pints. I'm trying to think of what else I use pints for. I have a family of 5, and we're all pretty healthy eaters, so quarts are my preferred canning method. But I do a lot of things. Barbecue sauce I'll do in half pints and pints, depending on what, if I'm going to add it to some baked beans, I don't need quite as much, and I'll use the half pints for that. But I'll use the pints when doing like a pulled pork or something like that. So half pints and pints, and then of course quarts. Again, they have wide mouth and regular size quarts. I use wide mouth quarts. I save them for 2 purposes. One is sauerkraut because I can pack them tightly. I can pack sauerkraut tightly in a quart, easier than I can in a regular mouth quart. I'll also do the meals in a jar that I'll talk about later. I do those in wide mouth just because they're easier to get out and in to the jar without breaking apart. So I save my wide mouth quarts for those 2 applications, and then I can everything else in regular quart jars. There are also half gallons and even gallon jars that you can can. They're wide mouth lids. Sometimes you can find a regular mouth half gallon, but most of the time I've seen them with wide mouth. These days anyway, there are some older jars out there that have the regular mouth. They do not recommend that you can in half gallons anymore. There are some older canning books that have recipes for half-gallon and gallon jars. They don't recommend that anymore. The reason is that it's hard to get the temperature all the way to the center of a big jar like the half-gallon and gallon jars. So beware of that. You can certainly cut those recipes down and put those same recipes into quart jars that you were putting in half-gallons and gallons. So water bath canning is different from pressure canning, and I want to just talk a little bit about both of them so that you clearly understand the difference. Things that you can water bath can are foods that are high acid, things that are pickled, tomato products. Tomatoes are very high in acidity. Things that have vinegar added to them, like green beans, for example. The other day I canned some dilled green beans, which required the addition of vinegar. So that I could do in my water bath canner because I was adding acidity to it. If I just can green beans, just straight green beans, I have to use a pressure canner because green beans in and of themselves are not a high acid food. If I were to pickle them, like I did earlier this week, then I can use the water bath canner. Which, my grandparents and my great-grandparents ate a lot of pickled foods, mainly because they didn't have a pressure canner. So they pickled their green beans, they pickled their beets, they pickled their carrots and cauliflower. So my heritage is German-Russian, as is Sue's, and there's a lot of pickled recipes in our family heritage because that's what they could do with it. They didn't really have pressure canners, so they could pickle them. Lots of different things with pickled. Sauerkraut is pickled cabbage. So pickling was the primary method of food preservation. But now that we have a pressure canner, we can really expand that repertoire and we can really expand the things that we can preserve in jars on our shelves. The other thing you can do in water bath canning is high sugar foods, your jams, your jellies, your fruits that you can with a syrup. And so those high sugar foods you can also do in a water bath canner. I did 19 quarts of peaches last week. The Youth for Christ peaches came in and they're awesome, and so we bought 3 boxes. We ate one, and then I canned 2 others, and I got 19 quarts on my shelf. And I don't even know why I put the date on them because they'll be gone by January, but I did label them with the date so that we know when they were canned. And so those are the 2 things you can can in a water bath canner, a high acid food and a high sugar food. Let's talk briefly about your canning tools. You will need a canner, and I'll show you a picture of a pressure canner coming up. You do need to put a jar rack in the bottom of that pressure canner. Every canner should have a jar rack. You want to keep the jar off the bottom of your canner. We want the boiling water to be able to circulate around. And in a pressure canner, we don't have a lot of water, maybe an inch or 2 at the bottom, but you want that water to be able to boil and create the steam to build the pressure. So if your jars are sitting on the bottom of your canner, you really can't create that steam and bubbling because your jars are sitting on the bottom. There's no room for it to go. So you want to have just a rack in the bottom. You can even use a round cookie rack. It doesn't have to be specific to your canner. You can use any type of thing that's going to lift them off the bottom. I even read of a lady who was using rings set on the bottom of her jar rings, set on the bottom of her canner, and then set her jars on top of that. So if worst comes to worst, that's what you can use. You do want to have a jar lifter. That's that handled item that's up in the top. It's shaped like an X. You do want to use a jar lifter. Those jars are boiling lava hot, and it really helps to have a good grip on them with that rubber jar lifter. You also want to have a lid lifter. That's the blue thing just to the left of the jar lifter. There are some old ladies who have no feeling in their fingertips because they kept sticking their fingers in their simmering pan of jars or lids and rings. No, thank you. I went and bought 2 new ones because my kids absconded with mine. I went and bought 2 new ones, and I think I paid 89 cents a piece for them. Good night. 89 cents to save my fingertips. I think I'll take it. There's also a ladle there. You want a funnel to put your food in, keep your jars nice and clean. What else? Oh, a saucepan to simmer your lids and rings. When you're doing pressure canning and you're doing a raw pack, you don't need to do that. If you're doing a hot pack, you will, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so the saucepan, you just want to simmer them. You don't want to boil them because that can denature the rubber. You just want to simmer them. I usually put it at about medium-low on my stovetop. Just a nice simmer, get them warmed up. You want that rubber in the ring to be malleable. You want it to be kind of pliable so that it makes a good seal with your jar. And here's one of my favorite quotes, that canned tomatoes are like summer saved, all that deep sun-kissed flavor ready to be enjoyed. And like I told you, I have a roaster full of tomato or pizza sauce that's cooking down right now, and oh my gosh, my house smells so good. So there's a pressure canner. This happens to be an all-American pressure canner. This is the brand that I recommend the most. Presto also makes one. There's a couple of other brands that make pressure canners. The reason I like All-American is that All-American does not have a gasket. It has a machined seal, so there's no rubber gasket that you have to replace or check to make sure it's still good. Your All-American has everything that it's going to need to work. My great aunt gave me her All-American canner, and it's at least 50 years old, and I put hundreds of jars through it a year. And this, people say, well, the pressure canner, that's expensive. Yes, it is. But when you take the amount that you're going to pay for it today and amortize that over 50 years of use, and once you have a pressure canner, you will can everything. There's nothing you can't can, and you will love to do it. So it's an investment. It's not an expense. My great aunt had it for 50 years and put hundreds of thousands of jars through it. I've put thousands of jars through it, and we're still using it. I'll probably give it off to my daughters. If you have a canner that you've received from someone and you're not sure that it works, take it to your extension office and have them test it for you, test the pressure for you, just to make sure that it holds pressure and that the dial is reading accurately. It's sad to say, but you can find these at yard sales for $1 because people don't know what they are. So make sure when you're there that you get all the parts, get the jar rack at the bottom. Look around because they may not know that it was supposed to go together, and ask some questions. But an all-American canner is an investment in your food production, and you will not regret spending the money. So people sometimes will confuse a pressure canner with a pressure cooker. They are two very different pieces of kitchen equipment, and you should not interchange them. A pressure cooker is a way to cook food in the pot itself on your stovetop and to do it quickly. A pressure canner is a way to preserve food in jars. And there'll be some people who tell you, oh, I just can in my pressure cooker. You shouldn't. It's not big enough to generate enough pressure for as long as it needs to can safely. You really need a pressure canner to do this safely. Pressure cookers are for food to be cooked on your stovetop in the pot. You don't want to use your pressure cooker as a canner, and you don't want to use your pressure canner as a cooker. Everything you put in your canner needs to be in a jar, and then you can it. Am I clear about the difference between the two? I have both of these items, and I use them for very different purposes. They should not be confused and used interchangeably. The anatomy of a pressure canner. A lot of people don't start pressure canning or never learned because they were always sent out of the house. Get out of the kitchen, I'm going to pressure can, it's dangerous. It's not dangerous. The canner is not going to explode. There are 3 ways that canner will vent itself before it explodes. It will not explode. There are 3 safety mechanisms built in. One is the counterweight at the top. One is the vent and cover lock, and the third is the dial gauge. These 3 things will release pressure before the canner explodes, thereby inhibiting the canner from exploding. Your canner will never explode. So don't be scared, don't be intimidated, don't be threatened by people who said, oh, I heard once the canner exploded. I've never met someone who actually had one. They heard of someone whose mother's aunt had one explode at her friends, but I've never heard of anyone who actually had one explode. It doesn't happen. The thing with pressure canning that's different than water bath canning, you can get it up to a boil, and if you're doing, let's say, tomatoes and it takes 30 minutes, you can get that water up to a boil and you can go fold laundry or do something else. You can leave it, is what I'm trying to say. When you are doing pressure canning, thou shalt not leave thy canner. You don't leave it. You're there monitoring your pressure, you're there monitoring your temperatures on your stove, make sure your pressure stays at the correct point. Most problems that run into in pressure canning is because they didn't stay with their canner. So my favorite thing to do is to do a pressure canning batch in the evening. I prep all my food I pick it in the morning, prep it in the afternoon, get ready to go in the canner, and then I do it in the evening. And I sit with a chair in front of my stove, and I sit with a book. And I say, sorry, honey, I'm not going to help you with that. I have to can. Sorry, I can't, kids. I'm canning. It's a great way to relax and watch your canner. So most canners' recipes use 10 pounds of pressure. You'll need to adjust for your elevation, but most recipes say, 10 pounds of pressure. I've done a few recipes that require 15. I can't remember what they were right off the top of my head, but there have been a few of them. But most of them are right around 10. Now the time is what's going to make your difference. Let's talk about what we're going to can. So you can can low-acid foods, like I talked about green beans. That's one of the low-acid foods that you can can in a pressure canner. Corn, pictured here, is another one. I loved canned corn. Oh my gosh. The stuff that you get from the store in the can is just yucky. The stuff that you can yourself, canned corn, oh, you open it up and just smell the jar and it just smells like summer. I love it. I see you have a question. Oh, Sue says you don't use 15 because we're 1,000 feet above sea level. I happen to be right below 1,000 feet, and so I use 10, and I've never had a problem. But again, check for your elevation, because if you're higher than I am, in the hill country north of Mandan, you probably need to do 15. You can go online to check your elevation. You could probably even call your soil conservation office or your FSA office. They should know. I'm trying to think of anyone else I would call. Anyone who would have land maps, which your FSA office is probably the best. Doesn't Google know that? Google Images, don't they know where I live? So, low acid foods, carrots, dry beans. Trying to think of other kind of plain foods low acid foods that I pressure can. Plain beets rather than pickled beets. Greens, you can spinach. That's a low acid food. There's every vegetable you can can it. Potatoes, that's low acid food. You can can potatoes. Dairy, you can can dairy. You can can cheese. You can can milk. Meats, you can can every meat. I've canned ham, turkey, chicken, beef, ground beef. I don't think you can can venison. I've done that. I'm trying to think what else. Pork, you can can sausage. Tons of good stuff to can. You can also do meals in a jar. I've done soups. Like I said, I've done a vegetable soup. I've done bean soup, split pea, chicken. I do it's like a basic chicken soup recipe. I don't put rice or noodles in it, even though you can. I just do chicken broth, chicken meat, onions, celery, and carrots. And then I can add that, I can put that in a Nefla soup. I can make that into a potato soup. I can chicken noodle soup, and add whatever I want to it. So that's I love to do that with chicken. And I usually do my chicken canning in the winter. I have more time then, and I pull it out of my freezer and can my chicken up. So lots of ideas for meals in a jar. I'll give you a good resource to get your meals in a jar recipe in just a few minutes. So what's going to change? The basic method of pressure canning is the same. What's going to change is the amount of time, and that's dependent on your ingredients. So for meat, any jar that contains meat, whether you're doing spaghetti sauce with meat or doing baked beans and you have meat in the jar, any recipe with meat is going to be canned for longer because meat has a long canning time. And so you want to make sure you're checking your recipe. If you can can your own recipes. So if you put, like for example, my vegetable soup varies from year to year. It kind of depends on what's ready in the garden when I'm ready to can vegetable soup as to what goes in it. So some years there'll be a tomato base. I do a tomato base. So it'll be tomatoes and peppers and onions and corn, kale, carrots, green beans, what else? Potatoes, all of that stuff you can put in a vegetable soup. Well, some years my corn isn't ready when my vegetable soup needs to be canned, so I don't put corn in it. And some years I don't put kale in it. And so it depends. You can use whatever recipe you want for your vegetable soup, and to pressure can it, you can it for the amount of time for the ingredient that takes the longest. So if I have a list of my ingredients, I want to check the pressure canning time for each of those ingredients, and whichever one is the longest, that's the time I do for my vegetable soup. So if you're doing vegetable soup with some beef stew meat, then you want to also take into account what's the time for beef stew meat, what's the time for corn, what's the time for kale. Those three things are going to be your longest time. Corn, kale, and meat are three of the longest. I don't remember which one of those is the longest or what it is. You want to check your canning book. But when I put those three things in a recipe, I know that that's probably going to be my longest time. I still will always check every ingredient and make sure I know which one is the longest. Does that make sense? Every time you can do whatever recipe you want, you just need to make sure you're canning for the ingredient that takes the longest. So these are some sausage patties canned up in a half-pint wide-mouth jar. And she just lightly browned the sausage patties. You want to just get them brown, and then she puts a little bit of broth in the bottom, a little bit of water, and then cans the sausage patties so they're ready to go for a quick breakfast whenever she needs them. Now you may think, well, why couldn't I just freeze the sausage patties? Well, there's only so much freezer space, and what if your freezer goes out? So whether or not we have electricity, whether or not I have other things that need to go in the freezer, these sausage patties are always ready to go on my shelf. So one of the great uses for pressure canning is we can have meat stored for long-term storage and ready to go in an instant. Let's talk a little bit about meals in a jar. I already talked about soups and how you figure that out. Stews, you can do stews. You want to can your stews a little thin. I would make the gravy after I've opened the jar rather than before. And so you want to make them a little thinner. That's important for food safety because you don't want to have too thick of a product that the heat can't penetrate to the middle. If the heat can't get to the middle, it can't get rid of all the bad bacteria. So we want to make sure that we have a thin enough product that the heat can get to the middle. Another thing with stews is, again, you can use whatever recipe you want. Just make sure you're looking for that ingredient that takes the longest. Also with stews, make sure you don't have any large pieces. You kind of want smaller pieces in your stews. Make sure you don't have any potatoes that are bigger than about the size of a ping pong ball. That's hard for the heat to penetrate to the middle of a potato. Pumpkin and squash is something you can also pressure can. And you don't want to can the puree. You want to can them in chunks and then mash them when you open the jar. So can them as a dice or a chunk, and then when you're opening the jar, drain the pumpkin off and then mash it for your puree. Meats, again, you want to make sure that you don't pack them too tightly, and so that you have a whole chub of hamburger in the middle. Well, that's too dense. You don't want to have too dense of a product. And so if you're going to can, for example, taco meat, if you want to can taco meat in pints so you're ready for tacos to go, you can just lightly brown the meat and then can it, season it, and then can it loosely packed in your jar. Potatoes as well, I remember I recommended that you cut them up. You can like when we dig our potatoes, I take all those little like quarter size and smaller potatoes that normally would just be left in the soil. We gather them up, and my kids scrub them, and then we pack them into quart jars, and then we can them. And so it makes really quick, fried potatoes for supper, or just throw them in with some scrambled eggs for breakfast. And so pressure canning is a way that you can use all of those small bits and make delicious food out of them. I'm going to share some of my favorite canning resources with you. Two of them you're going to recognize: the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. If you can get a hold of an older copy of the Ball book, I'm disappointed with the new copies. The new copies are primarily fancy jams and jellies, and they've really gotten away from what I consider real food, and they've gotten into fancy stuff that's more of a condiment than it is a food that you can put on the table for your family. So if you can get a hold of an older copy of the Ball book, there's better recipes, more usable for the family in the older books, but the new book is pretty fancy. Kerr also has a home canning and freezing book. Between the two of them, I think Kerr is more practical than the Ball book. And my all-time favorite, I just love it. It's my favorite book, and mine looks like it's my favorite canning book because it's spattered and splattered, is Growing and Canning Your Own Food by Jackie Clay. Jackie is a canner. She's a homesteader who lives off the grid in northern Minnesota. This woman literally cans everything, absolutely everything. When you live off the grid, you can't afford to have 5 deep freezers running, and so she literally cans everything. The book is, I recommend it. It's not as a first canning book because things are a little more complicated, but once you've pressure canned a few things, vegetables, for example, if you've done some green beans or some carrots or some sweet corn, you kind of get the hang of your pressure canner and you're ready to try some new stuff. Growing and Canning Your Own Food is a really excellent book. I mean, this book talks about how to feed a family with your canner. And so I recommend it, again, not as your first canning book, but as kind of the ready to take the next step canning book. She does have, some jams and jellies in there and that sort of thing, and definitely tells you how to can vegetables, both pressure and water bath canning, and she does a great job of, her recipes are clear. There's not a lot of pictures, so you kind of have to just have some confidence and say, yep, this is what Swiss steak is supposed to look like. And what I love, the best part about this book is her meals in a jar. This really got me to start canning meals for our family and not just side dishes like vegetables. And so she walks you through soups, she walks you through baked beans, she walks you through meats. I've done her meatball recipe. You can do Swiss steak. She does 2 different versions of clam chowder, which as soon as I can get my hands on 4 pounds of clams, I'm going to make. Just tons of stuff, how to can fish, how to can poultry, all the different meats. Talks about dairy, just everything that really takes canning to a whole new level is in Jackie Clay's book. She also blogs at backwoodshome.com, and you can submit blog questions to her, and she will answer them. I recommend scanning the search feature first, because if she's answered it in a previous one, she won't answer it again. But if you have a new question, she'll be more than happy to answer it. And she's just wonderful. I've met her in person, and she's my canning hero. I absolutely love her. And make sure you check out her blog, because she answers some extra questions there and different what-ifs, and just is a fountain of help and knowledge when it comes to canning, particularly pressure canning. Another book that's helpful if you're just wanting to do vegetables is called The Practical Produce Cookbook. I bought it when I started my CSA 7 years ago, and it's out of print now, which makes me very sad because it's an excellent book. And it talks about pressure canning, water bath canning, freezing, how to freeze, blanch and freeze. It's about produce, so it's strictly produce, but it's an excellent, this is how you do this vegetable. These are recipes that you can use with this vegetable. The Practical Produce Cookbook, you can find it on Amazon or A Books or Dover Books, the used book sites. eBay has it occasionally, but it's a great something to add to your canning library, particularly for vegetables. Storage. Let's talk a little bit about long-term storage. This is not my pantry, but mine looks similar to this. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 7 large shelving units in my pantry. I have them organized. The empty jars are on the bottom shelf of all of those, and then the full jars are on the top shelves. And, you know, sometimes that fluctuates. If we're at the season now where I'm just starting to can, I have a lot more empty jars than I have full jars. But that balance will swing in the next few weeks. And so I try and group my tomato products together, vegetables together, pickled products together, jams and jellies together, meals in a jar together, so I kind of know what area, you know, I'm looking for. Make sure you label all of your jars. I do not advocate using a paper label of any kind. Paper labels stick to the jars if you put them on the jars and you can't get them off. People who give me gifts of canned product and they put a fancy printed label on them, I just cringe because I'm never going to get that label off. So I write, I use reusable lids, or I use non-reusable lids, ball lids or cur lids, or you can order them in bulk that don't have any label on them. And I write with a Sharpie marker. So I write what it is and I write the date. So the other day I did relish and dilled green beans and pickles, and so I wrote pickles because I just did one pickle recipe this year. Pickles 14, relish 14. All my peaches, I just wrote peaches 14. So I know what it is and when I canned it. And then I try and use older product first and save the newer product for further down the road. When you're doing different types of pickles, make sure you label the different types. If you're doing chicken broth and chicken soup, make sure you label the difference. Labeling can save you a lot of headache because nobody really likes those mystery jars. I wonder if this is pickled beets or plain beets. So in my canning labeling, we do both regular beets, plain beets, and then we also do pickled beets. So my pickled beets recipe, I just label beets. And when I do quart jars of regular beets to, you know, have non-pickled, I write plain beets so that I know the difference. Well, my husband wanted to make beets while I was gone. And so he just went down and found a jar labeled beets, and he brought it up and sauteed it in butter on the stovetop. And it was pickled beets. And pickled beets, warm with butter, just do not taste good. So he thought that the beets were all ruined. And I said, no, you needed to get a jar marked plain beets, because beets is just pickled beets. So make sure you're using a naming convention that everyone in your family who's going to be using your canned items will understand. Make sure you're storing things out of direct sunlight. So I put them in your basement, and you want a place that has a fairly constant temperature, both night to day and summer to winter. That's why a basement works really well. We have ours in our basement in the southeast corner. It has one window on it, and we usually cover that window. And then the root cellar is attached. A small door in our fruit room, was what we call it, goes to our root cellar. So the root cellar also helps us to moderate the temperature in the basement. So you want to make sure, they don't need to be fancy shelves. I've seen some great shelves with cement blocks and wood. You don't have to buy anything fancy for storing your food, but just make sure that you store it up off the ground. You also don't want to store it stacked up on each other. If you need to stack another layer of jars, I recommend using just a piece of plywood and set it on the jars rather than stacking the jars directly on top of another jar. That's a way you can kind of get by. It's not recommended to stack jars, but that's one way you could get by if you really needed to. So, what questions do you have? Questions are answered here, even the silly ones. If you find yourself with a question, you're in the middle of canning or you want to can something and you're not sure how, email me at goodfood@morningjoyfarm.com. I'm happy to answer any canning questions. You can also call me. Our phone number is on our website, morningjoyfarm.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Sue wants to know, have you ever investigated using tin cans with your pressure canner? No. The problem I have with tin cans is that they aren't reusable. And I want to reuse them as much as I can. And right now I'm using lids that are one time only. There's a company called Tatler that has a reusable lid, which is a rubber gasket and then a plastic lid, and you can reuse them. I have not invested in them. They're a little more expensive, but they are reusable. And I give away a lot of canned produce, and I wouldn't want to give away those lids. So I haven't made the leap to the Tatler lids. I've heard nothing but good response from people who've used them. And so I kind of just need to take the plunge for the amount of cans that I put through, or jars that I put through my canner in a year. I should probably use them.
I use Taller lids and I absolutely love them, but I do have people sign contracts when I give them jars of food that they absolutely have to return that lid and that rubber ring with that jar. So it makes you kind of become more of a hoarder, I guess. So I see no other questions. Annie, any last comments from the peanut gallery there?
Well, I just would like to say that pressure canning can seem a bit intimidating, but if someone is there to hold your hand and I can be there virtually, I can talk it through with you on the phone or we can email. Um, you can do this. It's not hard. Once you learn how to pressure can and you've done it a couple of times, all you're changing out is the ingredients and the time that it's in your pressure canner. It's very standard. It's very routine. And like my husband says, if I leave something in the kitchen, chances are Annie's going to can it. So you can can just about anything. And there's no greater feeling of accomplishment than putting good food on the table for your family or your friends. Second to having my 3 children, there's nothing that gives me greater empowerment as a woman than putting good food on the table for my family.
So what's the longest that you've ever kept a canned good and then used it?
Oh dear.
I mean, it's okay to use it like years from now.
Oh yeah. As long as the lid is still intact and is still sealed, there's no reason that food shouldn't be good.
Super. Well, folks, if you missed it, we did record this session and you would be able to have access to it. You just need to go to our website and sign up for it, and you will receive a link for this wonderful pressure canning session today, kicking off our weekly webinar series. Annie will be back in October with, is it meals ready to eat or freezer meals?
Freezer meals.
Freezer meals. So you don't want to miss that. Tell your friends. And thank you for your time today. Thank you, Annie, for being such a wonderful presenter. And with that, I'll stop recording.